Welcome to Australia's Future with Tony Abbott. I'm Daniel Wild from the Institute of Public Affairs. Australia is facing its most significant challenges since World War II. Geopolitical tensions are increasing, cultural self-confidence is in decline. The values which define us, freedom, democracy, egalitarianism and sacrifice, are being put to the test. Over this special podcast series, Tony and I discuss how Australia can survive and flourish in the decades ahead. Hello, Tony, and g'day to all of our listeners, and welcome to a special episode of Australia's Future with Tony Abbott, dedicated to the achievements and legacy and memory of Queen Elizabeth II. Queen Elizabeth's reign of 70 years and 214 days, the longest of any British monarch, a remarkable period of rule, of stability, and of public service. Whilst we all knew that Queen Elizabeth was in ill health, nonetheless, the news of her passing came as a shock and a surprise, and we've seen an outpouring of mourning of billions around the world since. Tony, I can think of no better person than yourself to share your thoughts and reflections on Queen Elizabeth's legacy and her achievements and what it means for the future of the monarchy and the future of Australia. So, Tony, maybe we'll start by you sharing your thoughts and observations on her rule.
Thanks, Dan. And look, it's wonderful to be with you and with our listeners. Back on her 21st birthday, the then Princess Elizabeth, in a broadcast from South Africa, said that my whole life, be it long or short, shall be devoted to your service and to the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong. Well, a lot's changed since then, and the empire has become a commonwealth, but every single day, Queen Elizabeth was true to that remarkable pledge. It's been an amazing life of duty and service. Britain, Australia, Canada, PNG, New Zealand, all her realms and the wider Commonwealth and the wider world have been lucky to have her because of the extraordinary exemplar she became of duty, of honour, of commitment, of dedication. We don't see enough of these values in the modern world, and through good times and bad, she exemplified them, and probably one of the most remarkable lives of all time.
No, Tony, well put. I certainly think it was one of the most remarkable lives that we've witnessed and had the opportunity to be a part of. And I think you make an important point that a lot of the virtues that she exemplified and lived out in our modern era are often missing. It's an era often of innovation and ceaseless change for change's sake. But the Queen was an individual, but also an exemplar and a figurehead of stability and of permanence in a world of constant change. Do you think it's that permanence that is one of the foundations as to why so many have felt a personal sense of grief? To what do you attribute the outpouring of mourning that we've seen?
Well, Dan, there are very few people alive today who haven't grown up and if they're older, got old with Queen Elizabeth as a kind of a presence in their lives. This is one of the beauties of a monarchical system of government. The monarch is there for life, not just for 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 years. The monarch is there for life, and that gives all of the people in association with the monarch a chance to develop a familiarity and a connectedness. And that's not present in different systems of government where presidents and prime ministers come and go. One of the other great features of this particular system of government is its certainty.
Yes.
Every one of those 70 years, we knew that when the Queen did eventually pass on, the replacement would be Prince Charles, now King Charles. So we went to bed, as it were, on Thursday with Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth as our sovereign, and we woke up on Friday with His Majesty King Charles as our sovereign. And I guess if we were so inclined, we could have said the ancient cry, "The Queen is dead, long live the King," because that's what our system enables it to do. And while the last thing I want to do is engage in partisan debate over what may or may not become an issue in the future, I do think it's important at a time like this to acknowledge the great strengths of the system that we've got. The other point that I think is worth making, Dan, is that while almost universally the tributes have flowed to Queen Elizabeth for her personal strengths and her wonderful works, the person and the office are really indistinguishable. Someone like Queen Elizabeth could really only come to the fore in a monarchical system because she wasn't the kind of thrusting personality. She didn't have the kind of, I suppose, impatient drive to succeed that normally marks a politician. So really, if we had a different system, we wouldn't get someone like that. We'd get a very different type of person. I think it's important to remember that. I guess the other point to make is that here in Australia, our system is, if you like, a derivative of the Crown in Britain, because here in Australia, our Crown is represented by the Governor-General and by the state governors. And these are the representatives of the Crown appointed like a judge, as opposed to people selected by the Parliament or by the voters in the same way that a politician might be. So the nature of our viceroys is different thanks to the Crown. If we had presidents picked by the Parliament or elected by the people, again, you would get rather different personalities than you do in the retired generals, retired judges, retired academics that typically have become governors and governors general. So I think this has been a period which has exemplified some of the features of our system, which I hope people who might have been inclined to change it will reflect upon. I was listening to some people last night on Sky, Mark Latham, for instance, Graham Richardson, for instance, both of whom really paid lovely tributes to Her Majesty, and both of whom acknowledged the great strengths of our existing system. Both of them nevertheless felt the need to declare their continuing Republican instincts. And look, that's fair enough. People are allowed to be whatever they want to be in a society such as ours. But I do think we've seen our system at its best. A long, selfless and altruistic reign, a seamless transition, and already a King Charles showing a side of us that we might not have expected. For instance, in his first speech as king, he made the point that he was scrupulously intending to observe all of the constitutional conventions. And given that in his time as Prince of Wales, he was quite an activist heir, I think that's a bit of a change of pace, if you like, from our new king. And to me, it's probably a welcome change of pace. But I guess this was someone who, in a very long apprenticeship, might have occasionally chafed under the restrictions. But now that he has finally entered into his inheritance in every sense, I think we're going to see a king of absolute constitutional correctness and propriety.
No, well put, Tony. There's a couple of points that I want to pick up on. I might start with some of the observations you made about the Republican versus monarchy debate, and it reminds me of Nick Cater's article today in The Australian, which I thought was a very good article, Nick Cater being the head of the Menzies Research Centre. And I just want to put to you a quote by Nick and then get your reactions to that. So what Nick here is talking about Adam Bant and his push for the Republic, but he makes a broader point, and I'll quote you here. The Republicans of the 1980s and 1990s were driven by a sense of pride in a nation overflowing with confidence. The new Republican sentiment, on the other hand, is driven by shame. It aims not just to separate us from Britain, but from our own history, end quote. Tony, I reckon that's a pretty fair and astute observation by Nick Cater. I've never considered myself a Republican, but never felt that they were sort of anti-Australian in any way. I think they just had a different concept of what was good for the nation. But now perhaps those on more of the activist side of the Republican movement are driven by a sense of shame and a lack of confidence in our own nation, our history and our culture. So I think it's taken a negative turn over the last decade or so in the Republican movement. What's your assessment of the current state of the Republican movement and the sentiment that drives it?
There's no doubt that some of the wilder statements over the last few days appear to have come from people who are very ambivalent, to put it mildly, about our future. All this talk that we heard from a Green senator some months ago about refusing to swear allegiance to the colonialist Queen, etc. That does seem to be the motivation behind some of these, I think, slightly tasteless observations. But I wouldn't be quite as generous as Nick was to the Republicans of the 1980s and the 1990s. Sure, their pitch was a mature, self-confident nation doesn't need to hold on to the apron strings of Britain, doesn't need to keep the crown. And there's a sense in which, of course, we don't need to. We don't need the crown. We embrace the crown because it is actually the best possible system of government. History and tradition and the evolutions of history and tradition have given us a system of government which I believe works much better in practice than anything which the best contemporary brains would be able to devise from scratch. The great thing about a monarchy is that at the apex of our system, whether it's the Queen or the Governor-General, is someone who is above and beyond politics. And the Governor-General, as I was saying earlier, is a rather different kind of person by virtue of the fact that he or she represents the Queen and is picked like a judge than would be the case if he or she was supposed to be the embodiment of the people, as it were, and was picked by the Parliament or by the people in the way a politician might be. So look, my problem with republicanism now and then is that it was, in my opinion, likely to give us an inferior system of government. But B, it was likely to leave us a slightly diminished nation, because this argument that we won't really be independent, won't really be mature, won't really be fully free until we've gotten rid of the crown, suggests that the Australia of today and the Australia that we've been over the last 50 or 100 years is in some way inadequate or incomplete. And I just don't buy that. Australia has been legally independent in every sense since the Statute of Westminster in the 1930s, and the Australia Act of 1986 severed the last formal links between the British Parliament and the Australian Constitution. It repatriated the British Act, which enshrined the Australian Constitution. And I don't think anyone would say that the Anzacs that stormed ashore at Gallipoli were confused about their identity, or the diggers who slogged up and down the Kokoda track were confused about their identity, or the wonderful sporting personalities and champions who've represented Australia over the decades have been confused about who they were and what country they were representing. In every field, in the academe, in culture, in the arts, in science, in public life, in every field. Australians have been proud and self-confident patriots for as long as any of us can remember. And the fact that we have a heritage derived from Britain and we still maintain the wonderful institution of the Crown here in Australia in our own way, I think is a great strength, not a weakness or a flaw or a sign of some kind of national adolescence.
Yeah, and just to build on your observation about the superiority of our system as against the Republican model, I mean, if you can look at sort of Latin America, for example, many of those countries are almost ungovernable republics. The United States, in its own way, which is a marvelous, successful nation, has so many challenges, I would argue, owing to its Republican model. And I think the issue is that, and Peter Hitchens makes this argument in his most recent column in the Mail on Sunday, the UK paper, that one of the virtues of a constitutional monarchy is that everybody knows where ultimate power lies. So that the Queen may not exercise, the Queen or King may not exercise that power very often, but that's because they don't have to, because everybody knows where power lies and where the ultimate decision can be made. Whereas in a Republican model, and we can see this in the United States with the behaviour of various governmental agencies, it's very opaque as to where the ultimate authority lies. I think that's an underrated virtue of a constitutional monarchy that actually provides a hidden source of stability that you only get a sense of that when it's gone. Anything you'd like to add to that observation?
Yeah, well, there's no doubt, Dan, that the Crown is a symbol of unity and of continuity, and it's, I suppose, a source of authority rather than an actual centre of power. For instance, the monarch is a commander-in-chief who does not command, is a head of state who does not rule. But because the monarch's there is something which is denied to the politicians. And I think that's undeniably a good thing. There is a source of authority, there is a focus of loyalty, there is a symbol of unity which is not political. And I think that's incredibly important. And that's why I say we would lose something significant, something almost sacred, were we to change our system of government. Dan Hannan, who is well known to IPA supporters, he made an excellent point in his article over the weekend in the London Telegraph. He said, we're not just physical bodies, we are spiritual bodies. I think he might have been quoting C.S. Lewis. And the spiritual side of us needs nourishment as well as the physical side of us. And the ceremony, the ritual, and we've seen a lot of ceremony and ritual over the last few days. The ancient traditions of the Accession Council and the proclamation and so on, and we're going to see more of it in coming days with the Queen's final journey to lie in state in Westminster Hall, and then the funeral next Monday in the Abbey. This ritual and tradition and ceremony speaks to a part of us which is not often acknowledged in the modern world. I mean, we're very cerebral, if you like. We're very utilitarian in the modern world, and yet there is much to be said for all of these ancient ways and long cherished customs. This is, again, part of the magic of the monarchy, which is underappreciated but no less real for that.
Tony, you mentioned the rituals that have been taking place, and I'm sort of hesitant to ask you to opine on sort of day-to-day politics. So I'll offer you my opinion, and then feel free to chime in. But I got to say, I've found it a little bit off-putting to see, those who have been the fiercest proponents of the Republic, and Paul Keating, and as an example, Malcolm Turnbull, many others, who are making these fairly grandiose statements about the Queen and how much they admired her and so forth. I mean, I've got to say, I don't believe it for 1 minute. I find it very galling that they're making these statements, and I think it's a part of a broader strategy to divorce the Queen from the Crown. And this goes back to your point. They want the sympathy to lie with the Queen, rather than for the public sympathies to lie with the office that the Queen held. So that's my little rant about it. I've just found it very off-putting. But I'm just interested, how have you sort of assessed the tenor with which the fiercest proponents of Republican government have approached the current situation? Do you see this as just another example of politicking on their behalf, or do you think it's genuine?
Look, that's a good question, Dan. I think it was to Malcolm Turnbull's credit that he was clearly moved by the Queen's death, and I thought it was actually a rather lovely statement from Paul Keating when I read it. I think it's to their credit that whatever they think about the system, they can still respect and admire the individual who is at the apex of the system. But my point, Dan, is that the Queen would not have been able to do what she did and would not have been able to be what she was but for the system. I don't believe that you can separate the office from the office holder. And I would really hope that a lot of instinctive Republicans might reflect over these days on the coexistence of respect for the Queen with dislike for the office, and ask themselves this question. Maybe we should rethink the office, given that the office holder would not have been able to achieve all that she did and would not have been able to be all that she was but for the office itself. So, I was talking to a very close friend of mine over the weekend who has always been, if you like, an emotional Republican. I guess he sees himself as from Irish stock and likes to say he's a Fenian and all the rest of it, therefore he has to be a Republican. And he was saying, well, I'm actually not so sure. It really is a good system of government. And good on him for being able to say, well, maybe it is time to rethink. And a sign of maturity is being able to change your position after cathartic experiences or after profound new insights, or when new evidence is brought to your attention. And the global outpouring of respect and affection for the Queen that we've seen over the last few days is powerful evidence, very powerful field evidence of the strengths of a monarchical system of government, which I believe we would change at our peril and be diminished if we were to change.
No, thank you, Tony. That's a very, I think, a very welcome perspective that you offer. I just wanted to, as we close out our conversation today, you mentioned in your article for The Australian published over the weekend that my understanding is that you had personal contact with the Queen on one occasion as opposition leader in 2011 on her 16th and final visit to Australia. I'd just be interested, Tony, on the impressions that you had based on your personal interaction with the Queen, and if you could leave us with that personal perspective and what you learnt from your own personal encounter with the Queen.
Well, I had a few very brief encounters with her in other contexts. I was part of a receiving line a couple of times as a minister in the Howard government. Back in my days as a student at Oxford, the Queen attended the celebrations of the 80th anniversary of the Rhodes Scholarships. So I had a very, very brief interaction with her there. But yes, I was lucky enough to have a long talk with her as opposition leader in 2011. And without going into details or without, I hope, breaching any confidences, I found her a remarkable person. To be in her presence was quite uplifting because I was very conscious of the fact that here was someone who had seen so much, had met so many people, had I suppose, visited so many places and had been forced to reflect on so much over her time as sovereign. It really did give her quite an aura. And the conversation that we had it wasn't just polite chit-chat. We talked about some rather important and pressing social issues. And without in any way being jarring or discordant or strident, the Queen made some very strong points. But I guess such is the nature of the conversations between a sovereign and a subject, that I guess the spirit of it was different. And as I said, I came away from that conversation confident that our sovereign was a person of deep insight and strong views, but in no way partisan or party political. So, I felt very much uplifted by it, and it was a wonderful honour and privilege to have had.
No, wonderful, Tony. Thank you for sharing that story and providing us with your thoughts and insights as to what has been a remarkable 70 years. And I think we're all hoping that King Charles can live up to the example and achievements of his mother, which I'm sure he will. Early indications are that he's fortunately going to put some of the more activist components of his politics and his engagement in the public life to one side. So I think that's a welcome development. So Tony,
just a couple of points, Dan, before we go.
Please.
King Charles is not, as it were, coming to us out of nowhere. I mean, this is someone who has been very much in our public life for 40 or 50 years. He spent time here in Australia in 1966 as a kind of a junior housemaster at Timbertop, and he's really been quite well known to Australians ever since then. And I just want to make 2 points. First, some of those activist passions. Well, I don't especially agree with the things he said about climate and emissions, but on the environment more generally, he obviously has a passion for what's beautiful, what's good, what's stylish, what's tasteful, and the way his charities have done enormous work to preserve artisanship and craftsmanship, to keep alive trades and qualifications that might have passed out of our world, but for the kind of attention that the Prince of Wales, as he then was, lavished on them. This commitment to beauty, I think, is no bad thing at all in a world that can sometimes devalue that which has stood the test of time. The other point I want to make is that this incredibly long apprenticeship that he's had, I think, is going to stand him in very good stead. Charles has been brought up for 73 years to the life he is now going to lead. And sure, at one level, he's got servants and staff and palaces and all the rest of it. But it's an incredibly tough life. He never has a moment that's truly his own. He can't venture outside his front door without being constantly on display. Everything he says has got to be a model of decency, and everything he does has got to be a study in diligence. This is a very, very tough life, but I am confident that he will turn out to be every inch his mother's son and will be a wonderful and ultimately a popular monarch.
Well, excellent, Tony. That's a wonderful note to end on. And can I just say, on behalf of myself and our listeners, thank you so much for the time. We greatly appreciate your insights and assessment as always. And I'm looking forward to discussing, I'm looking forward to our next discussion shortly.
Thanks, Dan.
This is a production of the Centre for the Australian Way of Life at the Institute of Public Affairs. To find out more, visit australia.ipa.org.au.